Okay, welcome folks. We are picking up on this fine autumn morning right where we left off. So in the last video, we talked about Hume's theory of associationism uh, and a principle for where we get our ideas from that Hume called the copy principle. In this video, we're going to talk about uh, an objection that Hume himself anticipated for his view. And we'll look at Hume's answer, and we'll talk about whether Hume gave a good answer to his own objection to his theory that he noticed. Uh, so let's just come back by thinking about the copy principle. So the copy principle is a principle that tries to give an explanation of the origin of our ideas, right? Hume is going to say that every feeble perception, our ideas, this is things like remembering and imagining, uh, well, these are feeble perceptions as compared to our lively perceptions, which are the experiences that are vivid, like they're almost unavoidable. Uh, you know, what it is to sense, what it is to feel, what it is to hear. There's a big difference between sensing the leaves on a tree turning a color with the sun shining on them, as I'm perceiving right over there. Yeah, let's get those. So I gave you the idea of it. Now we can actually see those autumn leaves changing color. That's the difference between impressions and ideas, right? We could say that there is a big difference between, seeing autumn leaves turning color on a tree as opposed to just hearing the words and thinking about them, right? And Hume's theory is that every time you have an idea, the only place you can get it from is from sense perception. So first you sense it, and then those sensations will be copied into your memory and your imagination. This makes it possible for you to imagine things that you've never seen before, too. So you can imagine things like centaurs, right? Well, what is the idea of a centaur? Well, you take your idea of a horse, you take your idea of a man, and you mash them together. Right? Now that we've got the copy principle on the table, let's think about a problem for the principle that Hume himself recognized. Hume says this: there might be one contradictory phenomenon which may prove that it is not absolutely impossible for ideas to arise independent of their correspondent impressions. Says, I believe it will readily be allowed that the several distinct ideas of color which enter to the eye, or those of sound which are conveyed by the ear, are really different from each other. Pause. Now, what he's saying here is that each perception of color is its own thing, right? So we would say that, the shade of green that grass is different from the shade of green that Kermit the Frog is, right? Or the shade of red that car I see often in the distance there is a different shade than the color pink that, Pepto-Bismol is, right? So all these different things, these are all distinct, separate colors. So we're going to say, like, look, in a certain sense, the color of grass is different from the color that Kermit is, in the same way that violet is different from yellow, right? So we have a bunch of independent ideas of shades of color. Now, if this should be denied, it is possible by a continual gradation of shades to run a color insensibly into what is most remote from it. And if you will not allow any of the ideas to be different, you cannot without absurdity deny the extremes to be the same. So for instance, if you first say that red and pink are really the same color, then you would also have to say that pink and slightly purplish pink are the same color. And if you say that slightly purplish pink and pink are the same color, then lavender and pink cannot be distinct from one another. So what we might say is like, look, we get this gradation. If we're going to identify sameness between things that are different, we run into an absurd conclusion. Hume is not like this, so he's going to say, look, each perception of color is its own unique perception with its own unique idea that goes with it. Okay. Now, after we make this point about how each idea of color is its own distinct thing, he says, suppose, therefore, a person to have enjoyed his sight for 30 years. So somebody makes it to the age of 30, and they have become perfectly acquainted with colors of all kinds except for a particular shade of blue, for instance, which it has never been his fortune to meet with. Right. So this person is going to have perceptions of all the colors in the world except for one shade of blue. Right. So, you know, he is exposed to this shade of blue and that shade of blue and that shade of blue and all the distinct shades of blue that are between this one and between that one and the other one. But there is one shade that lives right here between this shade of blue, this one that's sort of on its way to being navy, and this one. And on this one, it's maybe like a darker version of cobalt, right? So we have this sort of quasi-cobalt, quasi-navy color between these two shades, right? Now, we show the man all the ideas of color that he's ever perceived, but we leave this blank. We leave this question mark in the middle here. He will perceive a blank where the shade is wanting, and he will also be sensible that there's a greater distance in the place between the contiguous colors and any other. So there is more distance between this shade and this shade than there is between this one and that one, or that one and that one. Now here's the question. Hume says, now I ask whether it be possible for him from his own imagination to supply this deficiency and raise up to himself the idea of that particular shade, though it's never been conveyed to him by his senses. Hume responds to his own question. He doesn't just leave the question hanging. Many teachers of philosophy and philosophical writing say, if you raise a question, don't just leave it hanging rhetorically, answer it for your reader. Hume does that. He says, I believe there are few, but will be of the opinion that he can, by imagination, think of the color between this color and that color. And this may serve as a proof that the simple ideas are not always, in every instance, derived from the correspondent impressions. So your idea of this shade of color, well, you're perceiving it through a sense impression right now. When you imagine it later, you could close your eyes and imagine the shade that you just looked at. That's copied from a sensation. But you have an idea of this color too, but that's not copied from a sensation. Right? So Hume is going to say that the copy principle, strictly speaking, is not absolutely true. But then he says that this instance is so singular that it is scarcely worth our observing and does not merit that for it alone we should alter our general maxim. Wait, what? Because what Hume is saying here is, I have a theory, right? Here's the theory that Hume is offering us. He's saying all ideas or imaginations, those are supposed to be copies of our impressions. And then he says, but now I'm going to give you an example of an idea that you have that isn't copied from an impression. Or at least somebody, this hypothetical man, is having an idea without having an impression to copy it from first. But Hume seems to be saying, well, this one example should not alter our general maxim. Well, wait a second, Hume. That just seems like bad philosophy, right? You've given a counterexample to your theory, the theory that says all ideas have an impression behind them, and then you show that the theory isn't true, but then he says, well, just for one counterexample, I'm not giving up the theory. In some sense, it seems like Hume is making a mistake, or maybe he's doing something cognitively biased. He's sticking with a theory even though he's just shown that the theory isn't true. So what are our options here when we deal with this example of the missing shade of blue? Well, one is to deny or revise the copy principle. And it seems like Hume is actually doing this to some extent. He admits that the theory is no longer absolutely true, as it were. And in this sense, that might be one way to go, to give up your empiricist theory of where ideas come from. Now, other people have denied that we actually have an idea of the missing shade of blue. So we might actually say the copy principle is still true, and Hume seems to think that everyone would say, few will be of the opinion that he can. In other words, he's saying that everybody's going to accept that you could get the idea of the missing shade of blue without sensing it. But maybe some people would deny that. Maybe you would say, like, look, when I look at a shade of blue and close my eyes, there's definitely this link between my perception and my imagining it later. Whereas, like, if I try to actually triangulate between these two shades here, maybe I'm not going to succeed in actually forming a clear idea in the same way that I can by looking at this and imagining the color that goes with it. And some people might say that the missing shade of blue doesn't violate the copy principle. So Hume gave us that argument that you say, like, look, each distinct color perception is its own simple idea. There are some people who want to say that insofar as you have an idea of a spectrum or a continuum, then you have an idea of the spectrum, which is copied from sense impressions, which allows you to fill in gaps that you haven't actually perceived. Now, perhaps Hume could reply to this by, look, if you haven't perceived all the colors, you won't be able to fill in the idea of a spectrum. And moreover, we do not actually perceive colors as compounded things, right? When I have the perception, or the imagination, that is, of a golden mountain, what I'm doing is I'm putting two things together, and I can see the part of the idea that's the gold part, and I can see the part of the idea that's the mountain part. But it seems like with the missing shade of blue over here, I'm having a perception of, the color cobalt with a certain saturation and hue. And maybe I also have the idea of darkening, right? And what I'm doing is I'm imagining cobalt, the color, darkening. So this might be a way of trying to stick with Hume's general idea in the copy principle, but we're still going to attempt to say, look, you don't have to have an idea of every particular to be able to triangulate to a particular. Now, here are some possible revisions. One suggestion I've heard is that what Hume really should have said is that all ideas can be traced to the senses. So we're not saying that all ideas actually are traced to the senses, but we're saying, like, look, insofar as you are not perceiving the missing shade of blue, you can still have an idea of the missing shade of blue because you can imagine what it would be like to have a sensation of a color that lived between this color and that color, right? So we might say that Hume is still going to be able to say, like, look, uh, this is ultimately a sense-based theory because we're saying there is no idea that couldn't be sensed at all. That would be a nonsense idea. Now, speaking of nonsense, it does seem in some places that Hume is suggesting that all ideas should be traced to the senses. So if you look at paragraph 8, this is where Hume lays out the missing shade of blue problem in chapter 2 of the Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding. In paragraph 9, he then says, look, we need the copy principle because the copy principle helps us distinguish between sensible talk and nonsense. So maybe one way to think about what Hume is doing is he's giving like a regulative idea for where our ideas come from. So, pardon my dog there. So we've been left with a philosophical puzzle for Hume and maybe some options on how to deal with it. Some people seem to think that, yeah, Hume is still onto something good with the copy principle, even if there is this problem for it. Other people, people who don't like Hume so much, are going to say, look, Hume actually found the big problem with his theory, but he's sticking with the theory anyway. And that shows maybe something deeply wrong with the empiricist project that Hume is going to lay out. As we're going to see, Hume is going to do a lot of his philosophical work by applying the copy principle. And you might ask yourself, is the copy principle with enough exceptions that it could undermine some of the philosophical arguments about things like cause and effect and miracles and God that Hume lays out later in the Enquiry? So I will leave that for you to think about, but until next time, be well. Thanks.